They say if you whisper her name 3 times into a mirror, she appears, bloodied, scorned, vengeful. But the woman behind the mirror was no spirit. She was flesh and blood. A princess turned pariah, a queen turned butcher. Mary Tudor was born in 1516 to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a golden child, educated in Latin, Greek, music and theology. She was charming, bright, deeply Catholic, heir to the English throne. But all that was torn from her. Henry, obsessed with producing a male heir, cast her mother aside and married Anne Boleyn. Mary, just 17, was stripped of her title, declared illegitimate, and forced to serve in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth. She was no longer the princess. She was a bastard, a servant. She wasn't even allowed to visit her dying mother. When Catherine passed, Mary wasn't informed until days later. She never got to say goodbye. Imagine growing up in silk and praise, only to be discarded like a stain on royal linen. She was crushed beneath shame, humiliation, and isolation. And underneath that weight, something began to grow. Not madness. Not yet. Conviction. A burning belief that one day, God would raise her up and punish those who had betrayed her. Years passed. Her father died. Her Protestant half-brother Edward VI took the throne. Mary, now in her 30s, was watched with suspicion. She was Catholic, devout, a relic of a faith the new regime wanted dead. She was tolerated, barely. When Edward died young in 1553, the Protestant court tried to deny Mary her birthright. They placed a girl named Lady Jane Grey on the throne, but Mary would not be erased again. She raised an army. Thousands of loyalists gathered to her banner. The people, especially the Catholic peasantry, marched with her. Lady Jane's reign lasted just 9 days. Mary entered London not as an exile, but a queen. The crowds cheered, bells rang. For the first time in English history, a woman ruled in her own right. But behind Mary's solemn smile was a silent vow. This kingdom would be cleansed, and fire would do the cleansing. Mary's enemies weren't just nobles or traitors, they were souls, lost in heresy. In Mary's eyes, Protestantism wasn't just rebellion, it was spiritual rot, corrupting the kingdom's very soul. It had torn her mother from the throne. It had humiliated her. Now it would be purged. In 1555, the fires began. The first victims were prominent Protestant bishops, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer. Latimer and Ridley were tied to stakes in Oxford. As the flames rose, Latimer shouted to Ridley, "Be of good comfort. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace, as I trust shall never be put out." But that candle lit nothing. The fire devoured them both. Their flesh blackened, their screams filled the square, their eyes melted in their skulls as the crowd watched, some in horror, others in fanatical glee. Then came Cranmer, the architect of the Protestant reforms. Forced to recant his beliefs, he signed a confession. But at his execution, in one final act of defiance, he placed the hand that had signed the confession into the flames first. "This hand hath offended," he said. Then he burned with it. But Mary didn't stop at clergy. Over 280 people were burned alive during her 5-year reign. Men, women, teenagers. In some towns, entire families were dragged to the stake, parents clutching their children as kindling was piled at their feet. In Colchester, a mother and her 19-year-old daughter were burned together. Their crime, owning an English Bible. In Canterbury, a blind man was led to execution. When asked to renounce his faith, he said, "I cannot see, but I can feel the fire, and I know my Saviour waits beyond it." The burnings were public, deliberate, slow. Executions were often carried out with green wood, wet, so the fire would burn low and long, prolonging the agony. The smoke choked entire neighborhoods, the stench of burning flesh lingered in market squares. Children grew up seeing blackened corpses collapse into ash where food stalls once stood. The Queen was unmoved. To her, each execution was not murder, it was a sacred act, a holy correction, a flame against darkness. But even as the fires roared, Mary's mind began to darken. She married Philip of Spain, a cold, distant man who viewed her as a tool. She became pregnant, or so she believed. Her belly swelled, her breasts ached. Court doctors announced an heir, but there was no child. Months passed, then more months. Finally, her stomach deflated. The baby never existed. It was a phantom pregnancy, brought on by hope, desperation, and delusion. She wept alone in the palace. Her husband left for Spain. She was mocked in whispers across Europe. Still, she remained obsessed with restoring the Catholic faith. Her advisors pleaded with her to stop the burnings. Even the Pope expressed concern, but Mary only tightened her grip. Spies were everywhere. Servants disappeared overnight. Neighbors reported each other to avoid suspicion. In one chilling case, a young woman in Essex was overheard praying silently in English rather than Latin. She was arrested, tortured, and executed 3 days later. Her crime? Thinking the wrong thoughts in the presence of God. England, under Mary, had become a crucible, and no one knew who would burn next. By 1558, Mary was dying. She was only 42, but years of illness and grief had hollowed her out. She believed she was pregnant again. She wasn't. In her final weeks, she whispered that dogs barked in the night, that ghosts visited her room, that the fires weren't high enough. She died on November 17, 1558, alone, childless, broken. Her half-sister Elizabeth, the same girl she had once forced into servitude, would now rule and reverse every trace of her reign. But Mary left behind more than laws or ruins. She left behind a legend. The name Bloody Mary entered English folklore. Not just as a monarch, but as a monster, a spirit, a curse. Whisper her name into the mirror, they say, 3 times, and she'll appear. But the real horror, she already did. She walked through courts and cathedrals. She wore a crown. She passed judgment. And she turned her own people into smoke and shadow. Mary Tudor believed she was saving England's soul. Instead, she drowned it in blood.